to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Welcome, and thank you for joining Deep Sleep Stories. Tonight you'll drift along a quiet coastal trail called the Blossoming Harbor Path, where moonlit flowers lean toward the sea, and every step feels softer than the last. Settle in now just as you are. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your jaw unclench. If your hands are holding anything, tension, worry, the leftover edges of the day, imagine you can place it gently beside you, like setting down a coat. There's nowhere you need to go and nothing you need to solve. Breathe in, steady and smooth, then release. Breathe in, steady and smooth, then release, unhurried. Feel the bed or cushion supporting you. Feel gravity doing its patient, dependable work, inviting every muscle to soften. A path begins beside the water, narrow. A path begins beside the water, narrow, welcoming, bordered by low stone and gentle blossoms. As you breathe, the scene grows clearer without effort, like mist settling into a calm shape. If thoughts wander in, let them pass the way clouds pass a quiet moon. You don't have to chase them away. You can simply watch them drift, then return your attention to the softness of the air, the steadiness of your breath, the sense of being safely held. And now, without any hurry at all, the story can begin to carry itself. On a certain coast where the land curved like a cupped hand, there was a harbor that had learned the art of resting. Boats lay at their moorings as though tucked under blankets, their ropes slack with trust. The water barely moved. It rose and fell in a slow rhythm against the stones, making a sound like a whispered conversation that no one needed to understand. Above the harbor, a path traced the shoreline. Locals called it the Blossoming Harbor Path, and they spoke the name the way one might speak of a lullaby, softly, with affection, as if the words themselves were part of the calm. The trail had been laid long ago, stone by stone, not for speed, but for savoring. It wandered, it curved, it paused beside benches, warmed by sun and cooled by night air. It dipped under old arches of wind-shaped trees, then rose again to overlook the moonlit bay. Of daylight and holding it, as if keeping of daylight and holding it, as if keeping a promise. There were small, star-shaped blooms that glimmered faintly as though dusted with the softest powdered pearl. There were climbing vines that twined around driftwood posts and low clusters of petals like tiny lanterns, glowing gently when the sky began to darken. Most nights, the path belonged to the quiet, to the tide, to the hush of distant gulls settling into sleep, to the scent of seaweed drying on warm rocks and the faint sweetness of blossoms leaning toward the salt. And on one especially serene evening, a traveler came to the harbor with unhurried steps. Her name hardly mattered because she carried no need to announce herself. Still, if the harbor had been asked, it might have answered with something simple, like the one who listens, or the one who arrived when the moon was kind. She had walked all day through gentle hills and meadows that shimmered with late-season grasses. She had crossed a small bridge where a stream chuckled over stones like a private joke. She had passed cottages with windows glowing honey gold, and once she heard someone humming inside, the sound slipping out through a cracked pane like warm steam. Now at the harbor's edge, she stopped and simply breathed. The air here was different. It felt rinsed clean by the sea. It held a coolness that was not cold, but refreshing, like linen sheets turned down in a quiet room. Her shoulders eased. Her thoughts, which had been busy earlier, began to quiet as if they too could hear the water's slow speech. A lantern stood near the beginning of the trail, perched on a wooden post. Its light was soft, not bright, and it did not insist on anything. It merely offered a gentle glow. Beneath it sat a small sign painted with delicate strokes, the letters curling like sea foam. Blossoming Harbor Path, it read. Beside the sign was a bowl carved of smooth stone, holding a few petals that must have fallen earlier in the day. The traveler reached out and touched one with the tip of a finger. It was cool and velvety, like the inside of a seashell. She smiled in the faintest way, and then she began to walk. The path welcomed her without fanfare. The stones were old, worn by countless feet and countless seasons, rounded at the edges like river pebbles. Between some of them grew thin lines of moss, luminous in the lantern light. The traveler's pace was slow, as if she had all the time in the world, as if time itself had slowed to match the tide. To one side, the harbor water held reflections, a few wavering lights from distant houses, a pale ribbon of moon, the suggestion of stars. To the other side, low dunes rose and fell, covered in grasses that whispered as the wind moved through them. The wind was gentle, careful not to disturb the stillness. It carried scents like offerings, salt, blossom, and the faint smokiness of someone's faraway hearth. After a short while, the traveler reached a spot where the path widened. Here, a small lookout jutted out over the water, bordered by a curved railing of driftwood polished smooth. A bench sat there, shaped to cradle the body. Worn by years of use, she sat down and let her hands rest in her lap. The sea was so calm it looked like dark glass. On its surface, a single ripple moved outward from a place where a fish had risen and slipped back down. The ripple widened in perfect circles, then faded into stillness again, as if the water had taken a breath and released it. The traveler's eyelids grew heavy for a moment, but she wasn't quite ready to sleep. There was something about this path that invited gentle curiosity, not the bright kind that searches for answers, but the quiet kind that notices and appreciates. She stood again and continued. As she walked, the blossoms became more numerous. They appeared in small clusters at first, then in drifts, like soft foam along the edges of the stones. Some blossoms were pale pink, like sunrise caught in a petal. Others were creamy white, reflecting the moonlight. A few were a soft blue, the color of twilight just before the stars emerge. The traveler noticed that the flowers moved in the breeze in a way that seemed almost intentional, as if they were nodding slowly to one another, sharing a secret. She slowed her pace even more. The world felt hushed, as if someone had turned down the volume of everything sharp. She passed beneath an arch formed by two old trees leaning toward each other. Their branches intertwined overhead, and hanging from them were thin strands of lichen that swayed like delicate curtains. Tiny droplets clung to the lichen, catching the lantern glow and turning it into scattered sparks. Beyond the arch, the path curved gently inland for a short stretch, as though it wanted to show her something different. Here, the air carried a touch of earthiness, and the sound of water shifted. It became not only the quiet lap of harbor waves, but also the faint trickle of a small spring somewhere nearby. She followed the curve and soon found it, a little stone basin set into the ground, fed by a narrow stream of clear water. The spring ran steadily, making a sound that was neither loud nor silent, but soothing, like a soft ribbon being drawn through fingers. Beside the basin grew blossoms that were slightly larger and more luminous than the ones along the shoreline. Their petals held the light, as if lit from within. The traveler knelt, dipping her hands into the spring. The water was cool and pure, and when she lifted her hands, droplets slid down her skin slowly, shining like tiny beads. She let the water soothe her palms. Then she pressed her hands gently to her cheeks. A quiet calm spread through her, as if the spring had reminded her body of something it already knew: how to soften, how to rest, how to let the moment be enough. When she stood again, the path seemed to hum in a barely there way. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like a distant melody remembered in the body. She turned back toward the sea, following the stones as they led her once more along the harbor's edge. The lanterns were spaced along the path at wide intervals, each one a small island of glow. Between them, darkness rested comfortably. The traveler realized that she could see perfectly well, even when she stepped beyond the reach of a lantern, because the moonlight was generous, and the blossoms themselves offered a faint luminescence. It was as though the path did not want anyone to feel lost. It wanted to be followed without strain. As she walked, she began to notice small details that felt like gifts. A shell placed carefully on a stone, as if someone had found it and decided it deserved a special spot. A piece of sea glass nestled in sand at the edge of the trail, smooth and misty, catching light like a quiet jewel. A little carved symbol on the side of a driftwood post. Two simple curves that looked like waves cradling a star. Farther along, she encountered a tiny wooden gate, not meant to keep anyone out, but simply to mark a transition. The gate was open, and the traveler passed through without touching it. Beyond it, the blossoms thickened, and the air grew even sweeter. This portion of the path was known to some as the Blooming Bend. Here the flowers climbed higher, forming gentle walls of petals and leaves. The trail narrowed again, and it felt like walking through a living corridor of fragrance. The traveler moved slowly, her breath unconsciously matching the hush around her. In and out, steady and soft. At the center of the Blooming Bend, she found a small circular clearing. The stones formed a ring, and in the middle was a low mound covered in moss and tiny blossoms. A single lantern hung from a branch overhead, and its light was the color of warm cream. On the mossy mound sat a little bowl, and inside the bowl lay a few blossoms that had been arranged with care. The traveler did not touch them. She simply looked, letting the sight settle her even deeper. The arrangement felt like a quiet offering to the night, a way of saying, "We are here, we are safe, we are at peace." As she stood there, listening, she became aware of a sound that wasn't the water. A soft chime, almost too faint to notice, like the smallest bell, kissed by wind. She turned her head slightly, trying not to disturb the moment. The chime came again, and she realized it was coming from somewhere farther along the path, around the next curve. Curiosity stirred, but it was a gentle curiosity, like a cat stretching in a warm patch of sun. The traveler began to walk again, following the stones as they led her forward. The chime grew a little clearer, though it remained soft and distant. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, threading itself into the calm. Soon the traveler arrived at a place where the harbor opened wider. The water here was less sheltered, and the horizon stretched farther, though the sea remained calm. A long pier reached out into the water, and at its end stood a small pavilion, a simple structure with a peaked roof and open sides, built of pale wood that looked silver in moonlight. From the pavilion's eaves hung several wind chimes made of shells and polished pieces of driftwood. They moved gently, creating that soft, sleepy music the traveler had been hearing. She stepped onto the pier. The wood beneath her feet was smooth and slightly cool. The pier creaked faintly, not in complaint, but in the way old wood speaks when it settles. The traveler walked to the pavilion and stepped inside. Within, there was a bench that ran along the inner edge, and on the bench were folded blankets, neatly stacked. There was also a small basket containing cups and a jar of something that smelled like herbs and honey. Someone had prepared this place for anyone who might arrive, anyone who might need a pause. The traveler sat on the bench and drew one blanket over her shoulders. It was soft, woven with care, and it carried the scent of lavender and sun-warmed linen. She felt her body sink into comfort. her muscles releasing tension as if they'd been waiting for permission. On a small shelf inside the pavilion sat a kettle, and beside it a little spirit lamp that could be lit. The traveler didn't need to light it. The night was already warm enough and the calm was complete. Still, she appreciated the quiet generosity of the setup. The sense that the path was not only beautiful, but kind. She watched the water for a long time. The surface glimmered where moonlight touched it, and occasionally a tiny wave caught the light and carried it forward as if ferrying silver to shore. After a while, the traveler stood again and returned along the pier, the blanket folded neatly back into its stack. She left the pavilion as she had found it, with everything ready for the next wanderer. Back on the main trail, she felt as though she had stepped into a dream that knew exactly how to hold her. The blossoms glowed gently. The lanterns watched over the stones. The wind was mild and the world seemed to breathe with her. The path continued, curving along the shoreline and then rising slightly. As it climbed, the traveler found herself looking down at the harbor from above. The boats were small shapes now, dark and peaceful. The lights along the shore looked like fallen stars gathered in a line. At the top of the rise, the path leveled out and passed through a meadow. This meadow was unlike the others she had walked through earlier, because here the flowers were not just at the edges. They spread across the grass in soft patches, creating a quilt of color under the moon. In the center of the meadow stood a single tree, broad and old. Its branches reached outward like welcoming arms, and beneath it was a circle of smooth stones where people might sit. The traveler approached the tree and placed a hand on its trunk. The bark was cool, ridged, and steady. The tree felt deeply rooted, patient, as though it had watched countless nights arrive and depart without ever needing to hurry them along. The traveler sat within the circle of stones and leaned her back against the trunk. Above her, leaves rustled faintly, and between the leaves, the stars were visible. Soft points of light scattered across a sky so deep it felt endless. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. There was the sound of the wind chimes far behind her, a whisper now. There was the gentle lap of waves, distant but steady. There was the quiet chorus of the meadow, tiny insects, the faint sigh of grass, the subtle shifting of leaves. And in that listening, she felt something ease inside her, something that had been tight for so long she hadn't even noticed it. It loosened like a knot coming undone. When she opened her eyes again, she saw something small moving through the meadow. A light, not a bright light, not a startling one. A soft, floating glow like a firefly, but steadier, as if it carried a lantern no bigger than a seed. The light drifted closer, bobbing gently. The traveler did not move. She simply watched, calm and curious. As the glow approached, it revealed itself to be a tiny lantern, suspended from a slender stem of something that looked like a flower, though no flower she'd seen before. The stem was thin and graceful, and the blossom beneath the lantern was a delicate shape. like a bell turned upward to cradle light. The traveler blinked slowly, and the glow hovered near her, as if greeting her. Then, without sound, it drifted toward the path, pausing as though to invite her to follow. The traveler stood, feeling no fear, only a quiet sense of wonder. She stepped back onto the stones and followed the little floating lantern as it guided her forward. The path now felt even more enchanted, though nothing about it was loud or dramatic. The magic here was the kind that whispers, the kind that asks nothing of you except that you notice. The small lantern led her along a stretch of trail that dipped down into a sheltered hollow. The air here was warmer, and the scent of blossoms grew richer. The stones beneath her feet were smoother, as if polished by years of moonlit walks. The hollow opened into a garden that the traveler had not expected to find. It was tucked between gentle hills, hidden from the harbor's main view. In the center of the garden was a pond, perfectly still. The water reflected the sky so clearly that it looked like a second night had settled into the earth. Around the pond grew blossoms in every shade of soft light: cream, blush, pale violet, and silvery blue. Some flowers floated on the pond's surface, their petals spread like small boats. Others grew along the bank, leaning inward as if admiring their reflection. The little lantern drifted to the pond's edge and hovered over the water. Its light fell onto the surface, and the reflection shimmered. The traveler stepped closer and looked down. In the pond's mirror, she saw not only her own face, softened by moonlight, but also the harbor behind her, though she could not see it directly from this hollow. She saw the pier and pavilion in miniature, the lanterns along the path like a string of pearls, the boats resting in their quiet line. It was as though the pond held the whole coastline in its gentle memory. She watched, and as she watched, the reflection shifted, not quickly, not sharply, but like a dream slowly changing. The harbor lights became brighter for a moment, then dimmer, as if time itself was breathing. The path's blossoms seemed to open and close in a soft rhythm. The water carried ripples that moved outward, then faded into stillness again. The traveler felt her mind quiet even more. She did not try to interpret what she saw. She did not try to understand it. She simply let it soothe her, like watching embers glow in a hearth. The little lantern drifted again, moving along the pond's edge until it reached a small stone seat, shaped like a crescent moon. It hovered there, then lowered slightly, as if pointing to the seat. The traveler sat. The stone was cool at first, then slowly warmed beneath her. The air in the garden felt thick with calm, like a blanket woven from scent and silence. She inhaled, and the fragrance of blossoms filled her chest, sweet, soft, and comforting. Above the garden, the sky was open, stars hung like quiet lanterns. The moon's light poured down gently, turning the pond into a pool of silver. The traveler's eyelids grew heavy again, and this time she let them rest, half closed. She listened to the hush of the garden, the tiny sounds that lived inside stillness. Somewhere, a nightbird called once, then fell silent again. Somewhere else, a leaf detached from its branch and drifted down, landing so softly it made no sound at all. The little lantern hovered close, and its glow seemed to pulse in a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat. The traveler found her own breathing matching it, in and out, steady and calm. After a long while, the lantern drifted away, moving toward a narrow opening at the far side of the garden. The traveler stood and followed, her steps slow, her body relaxed. The opening led to a short passage lined with blossoms that climbed up the stone walls like gentle vines. The passage was not dark because the flowers themselves glowed faintly and the little lantern's light guided the way. The passage emerged back onto the main harbor path, but at a point farther along than where the traveler had been. It felt as though she had stepped through a fold in the landscape, a quiet shortcut offered by the garden. Here the harbor looked different. The water was closer, the stones narrower, the path ran right alongside the sea, so near that the traveler could hear the water's softest movements. She walked on, accompanied now only by moonlight and blossoms, as if the little lantern had completed its gentle task. Soon she reached a place where the path widened once more, forming a small terrace overlooking the sea. At the terrace's edge stood a low wall of stone, and beyond it the water stretched out into darkness. On the terrace was a small structure, half shelter, half shrine, built of pale wood and carved with delicate patterns of waves and flowers. Inside, there was no statue, no figure, no grand symbol, only a simple bowl filled with water, and floating in the water were a few blossoms. The traveler stepped inside the shelter and stood quietly. The bowl's water reflected her face, and the blossoms drifted gently on its surface, moving with tiny currents she could not see. Watching them felt like watching thoughts drift by, arriving, floating, then moving on. She placed her hands on the edge of the bowl and leaned forward slightly, letting the reflected moonlight wash over her eyes. She felt as though she could sink into that light, as though it could carry her somewhere soft and safe. Outside the shelter, the wind moved through the terrace, bringing the scent of the sea. It was a scent that spoke of wide horizons and deep calm, of waves that traveled without hurry. The traveler stepped back out and sat on the terrace's stone bench. From here, she could see the curve of the path behind her, and ahead of her, lanterns glowing like gentle markers. The blossoms along the trail looked like a slow river of petals flowing through the night. She sat for a long time, letting her mind soften. In the distance, a lighthouse blinked slowly, its beams sweeping the sea with patient steadiness. The light was not harsh. It was reassuring, like a hand resting lightly on a shoulder. The traveler watched the beam pass, then pass again and again. Each sweep felt like a lullaby line repeated softly. As she sat, she remembered little things, not in a sharp way, but in a drifting way. The warmth of sunlight earlier in the day, the sound of the stream under the bridge, the gentle hum of a cottage song. These memories floated through her mind like blossoms on water, and she let them pass without holding on. When she finally stood, her body felt heavier in the most pleasant way, like a blanket settling over her limbs. She began to walk again, following the blossoming harbor path as it led her toward the far end of the harbor. The farther she went, the quieter everything became. The harbor lights grew fewer, the buildings more distant. The sea's voice grew more prominent, but still gentle, still slow. The path here was bordered by thicker clusters of flowering shrubs, their petals catching moonlight and turning it into a soft glow. The shrubs formed a kind of living hallway, guiding her forward with fragrance and light. At the end of this hallway, the traveler found a small cottage. It was not grand. It was simple and charming, tucked into the curve of the land. Its roof was covered in pale shingles, and its windows glowed softly from within. Around the cottage grew blossoms that climbed the walls, weaving themselves into the wood like a gentle embrace. The traveler approached the door, and before she even touched it, it opened. An elderly keeper stood there, wrapped in a shawl the color of sand. Their face was lined with kindness, and their eyes held the calm of someone who has spent a lifetime listening to tides. The keeper did not ask questions. They simply smiled and stepped aside, inviting the traveler in. Inside, the cottage was warm and dim, lit by lamps with shades made of paper-thin shell. The light was soft and golden. The air smelled of herbs, tea, and clean wood. There was a small table set with a cup already waiting, steam curling gently upward. There was a hearth with embers glowing, not roaring, just quietly alive. There were shelves lined with jars of dried blossoms and bundles of fragrant leaves. The traveler sat in a cushioned chair near the hearth, and the keeper placed the cup in her hands. The tea tasted faintly of honey and chamomile, with a hint of something floral that reminded her of the glowing garden. Each sip seemed to smooth out another crease inside her, easing her into deeper relaxation. The keeper sat nearby, not speaking, simply sharing the quiet. Outside, the sea continued its slow conversation with the shore. Inside, the hearth's embers pulsed softly. After a while, the keeper stood and guided the traveler down a short hallway. At the end was a small room with a bed made up in fresh linens. The sheets were pale and cool, and a blanket lay folded at the foot, woven with a pattern that looked like waves and blossoms intertwined. The window beside the bed was slightly open, letting in a faint breeze, carrying the scent of the harbor path. Through the window, the traveler could see a portion of the trail, the blossoms glowing gently like a line of sleepy stars. The keeper nodded once, a quiet good night, and left the door slightly ajar, so the room felt open and safe. The traveler lay down. Her body sank into the mattress as if it had been waiting for her. The linens cradled her. The blanket, when she pulled it up, felt like the softness of the meadow and the steadiness of the old tree. Outside, the wind chimes from the distant pavilion chimed faintly, carried by the breeze. The sound was so soft, it felt like it came from within a dream. The traveler's breathing slowed, in and out, smooth and even. Her thoughts drifted like petals on water. She did not need to follow them. She could simply rest beneath them, like a calm pond beneath floating blossoms. The harbor held its quiet. The path held its glow. The night held everything gently in place. And as the traveler's eyes grew heavier, the world seemed to soften further, as if even the air had become a lullaby. In the cottage room, the light from the hallway faded to a gentle dimness. The traveler lay still, her face relaxed, her hands resting loosely on the blanket. The open window offered a cool kiss of sea air, and with each breath she took, her chest rose and fell like a small tide. Somewhere beyond, the blossoming harbor path continued to glow, but now it felt far away, like a memory already blending into sleep. The flowers along the trail swayed slowly. Lanterns watched over the stones. The water in the harbor rose and fell with patient calm. The lighthouse beam swept the sea again and again, its rhythm steady, soothing, predictable. In the traveler's mind, the garden pond shimmered softly, reflecting the moon. Blossoms drifted on the water's surface, floating without effort. The wind chimes sang a quiet note, then rested. Everything was unhurried, everything was gentle. The traveler's breathing became even slower, even softer, as if her body was remembering how to sleep deeply. The muscles of her face smoothed. Her shoulders melted into the bed. Her legs felt pleasantly heavy, grounded, safe. Outside, the tide whispered. Inside, the hearth's embers glowed faintly, then dimmed a little more. The world kept its calm watch as sleep drew nearer, like a warm blanket settling over a resting mind. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.